I saw it with my own eyes. I saw my brothers fall, not from the clang of steel, nor from the blows of other knights' swords, but from countless arrows that flew from unseen distances. My armor, my pride, a symbol of 1,000 years of strength, proved useless. It could not protect us from this new merciless terror. That day I understood. The era of chivalry, as we knew it, was dying. And it was not just the end of our glory, it was the end of our entire world. For me, as for anyone who lived in my time, chivalry was not just a phenomenon. It was the backbone of our existence, the very essence of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. I saw how it shaped our structure, how it defined service, land ownership, and the distribution of power. My image, the image of a knight, was forged over centuries, closely intertwined with the harsh conditions in which we, the people of the West, survived after the catastrophe, the fall of the great Roman Empire. I remember, or heard from my fathers, how imperial administration literally vanished before our eyes, how the last remnants of regular armies melted away. External threats grew and multiplied, and military service became the sole pillar of local authority. It was I, or someone like me, who came to the forefront. One who could fight, who could defend their land and their people. It was we, the horsemen, clad in heavy armor, armed to the teeth, who gained an undeniable advantage. Our mobility, our devastating striking power, made us the key fighting unit, without which survival in this chaos was unthinkable. I read in old chronicles of the Frankish Empire that as early as the 9th century, mounted warriors receiving land for their service were mentioned. They were the precursors, the seed of what chivalry would become. By the 10th century, our heavily armed cavalry had taken its rightful, central place in the military system. The term chevalier, horseman, appeared, but for me and my brothers it meant much more. It was a warrior bound by sacred duties. Over time, chevalier became a symbol not just of a warrior, but of a person with a special status, a person of honor and duty. My knighting ceremony transformed into a formalized sacred ritual, confirming my belonging to this chosen class. The title was hereditary, and we, the knights, took a firm, unshakable place in the class hierarchy. We lived in a world where personal ties and oaths defined the entire political order. The system of mutual obligations between lord and vassal became the foundation of our feudal system. For my loyalty and military service, I received protection and land, which I was obligated to hold, manage, and defend. These relationships were regulated by ancient customs and established rights, gradually gaining legal force. In France, my homeland, chivalry strengthened amidst the most severe feudal fragmentation. Royal power was weakened to its limit, and each feudal lord sought to rely on his own military retinue. I, a knight, became part of the local authority, and it was in this crucible that a special culture of service formed, where norms of behavior were maintained, not only by commands, but also by unwritten etiquette, and of course, in literature, enduring images of the noble warrior, living by rules of honor, emerged. The English model, as I know, developed quite differently. After the Norman conquest in the 11th century, a centralized structure was established there. Each knight knew his lord and received land in exchange for service, formalized by strict obligations. My military function was often combined with administrative duties. We, the knights, participated in local governance, jurisdiction, and maintaining order. By the 13th century, our class became an integral part of the political system. Our position was confirmed by birth, upbringing, and a special right that distinguished us from all other classes. The Christian Church, with which we were closely connected, sought to guide us towards observing established norms. We were instructed to protect the weak, maintain loyalty, and live in accordance with religious duties. Under the Church's influence, the concept of chivalrous conduct took shape, encompassing personal honor, restraint, and obedience to the established order. I, the knight, became a figure upon whom local authority, military organization, and the ideology of service rested. Chivalry formed over several centuries, and left a profound mark on the social and cultural history of Europe. I will try to tell you how it emerged, developed, crystallized as a class, and how it changed over time. Chivalry, as a military class, formed amidst the profound political and social changes that swept across Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The empire, which had lasted for about 5 centuries, was not merely a military power, but also a complex system of governance, law, trade, and administrative control. I know it connected various peoples from the British Isles to North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Balkans. Roads, garrisons, currency, and a unified legal framework were maintained. However, by the early 5th century, internal stability began to irrevocably crumble. Economic decline, a reduction in the free peasantry, increasing reliance on mercenaries, administrative overload, and constant border pressure transformed the once mighty empire into a weakened shell. Germanic tribes, who had previously served in the army and formed alliances with Rome, began to settle within its territory and displace the former elite. In 410 AD, Rome was captured for the first time by the Visigoth army under the command of Alaric. This act became for me, as for many, the symbolic beginning of the end. The formal dissolution of the empire occurred in 476 AD, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic military leader. His nickname, Augustulus, meant Little Augustus, and carried a derogatory connotation, as he was too young and possessed neither real power nor authority. Although the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued to exist, in the West, the political space became fragmented. Instead of a unified structure, dozens of small kingdoms and lordships emerged. Laws no longer emanated from a central authority. Instead of imperial officials, power passed to local chieftains, the military nobility, and tribal elites, who acted solely on the basis of force. In these circumstances, the population desperately sought protection from those capable of holding land and organizing armed resistance. Thus began the establishment of the feudal order. Its foundation was personal agreements between a landowner and one who was willing to serve him with arms. Land granted for use became a pledge of loyalty. These parcels were called fiefs, and the relationship between the landowner and the fighter was vassalage. This form of dependency included obligations secured by public oath, symbolic gestures, and vows. Gradually, a complex hierarchy formed in which every person knew to whom they owed service and from whom they received protection. These relationships were not uniform across all regions, but at their core lay the same pattern. Land was given for service. Service demanded patronage, and patronage obligated loyalty. Society became militarized and stratified by class. Military power was now based not on universal conscription, as in the Roman Empire, but on personal obligation. A specific individual, myself or any other vassal, was obliged to serve in exchange for land, patronage, and status. I was required to arrive at my lord's summons, bring armed men with me, and also maintain order and participate in the defense of the holdings. This system took root particularly quickly in Gaul. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the Franks established dominance here. Their power was based on an alliance of tribal nobility and the royal dynasty, with the military elite playing a key role. The reign of Charlemagne was of exceptional significance. This king, and later emperor, not only expanded the borders of his state, but also established a new method of governance. He actively used land grants to secure the loyalty of his retainers. Land became a reward for participation in campaigns, border defense, suppression of rebellions, and regional administration. Charlemagne created a network of supporters. Each of them was obligated to provide armed men as soon as a threat arose. This contributed to the emergence of a new military stratum, heavily armed horsemen. We, these warriors, differed from the peasant militia. We had our own horse tack, armor, weapons, servants, and the opportunity to train in warfare from a young age. This type of cavalry required substantial finances and training. A horseman had to master horsemanship and skillfully handle a spear, sword, and shield. I supervised equipment, commanded, participated in assemblies, ceremonies, and courts. A knight's service encompassed not only war, but also governance. Such individuals were called by various names. In Latin texts, milites; in administrative documents, equites; and among the common folk, caballary. However, it was in France that the term chevalier gradually took hold. It originated from the Latin word caballerius, and denoted a mounted warrior serving a lord. This word transitioned from everyday lexicon into class terminology, and became a symbol of a new order, based on military dependency, oath, and personal allegiance. With the establishment of the feudal order, Western European society gradually acquired a rigid hierarchical structure. The concept of three main estates, each performing its divinely ordained function, became entrenched. This idea found expression in the Latin formula, orators, bellators, and laborators, which translates as those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Its origin dates back to ecclesiastical treatises of the 10th-12th centuries, and it quickly became ingrained as a way to explain why social inequality was considered natural and proper. Those who pray included priests, monks, and bishops. Their task was to pray for the entire Christian world, guide souls to salvation, and ensure the spiritual purity of society. Through sermons, rites, rituals, and the vow of celibacy, they became intermediaries between man and God. Those who fight, in turn, guarded the established order. We possessed the power, the right to bear arms, the ability to act in combat, and to defend the interests of our lords and the king. We maintained local authority, suppressed rebellions, accompanied priests on pilgrimages, and engaged in the defense of holdings. We were considered guardians of peace, whose valor was combined with discipline and loyalty. Those who work formed the base of the entire social pyramid. They plowed the land, tended livestock, built homes, forged metal, maintained roads, and supplied all of society. These included peasants, artisans, merchants, and town dwellers. Their labor ensured the existence of the other estates. They contributed the primary tax revenue and produced all necessities. Their lives were hard, but it was upon their labor that the entire system rested. Such a division served not only a descriptive function but also solidified the notion of class immutability. Every person fulfilled their assigned role. Everyone submitted to the divine order, established for centuries. This idea lay at the core of my medieval worldview. We, those who fight, held a special place. Those who bore the sword and served a lord formed the pillar of the entire feudal structure. Our position was defined by the right to military service. This right was publicly recognized through participation in campaigns, the swearing of an oath, and subsequently through a special initiation rite that distinguished me, the knight, from a common soldier. Military service, formalized by oath and agreement, transformed into a title. I, the knight, became a representative of a class associated with power, and received a name and emblem confirmed by feudal tradition. Chivalry in medieval Europe constituted a strictly restricted class. Membership in it was determined primarily by birth. Knights were men born into families of free feudal lords. Lineage was confirmed by the right to participate in military service, receive a fief, and gain recognition from other members of the nobility. Access to our class was closed to the dependent population. Rural inhabitants, who were under the lord's control and deprived of legal freedom, were not included among those who could be knighted. In different countries, such people were called by various names, for example. Servi or villains. Their status did not permit them to own land, move freely, or bear arms. Even with wealth or meritorious service, they remained outside our chivalric circle. In individual cases, it was possible to be elevated to knighthood for outstanding military service, but such examples were exceedingly rare. Even in families of free landowners, the status of knight did not transfer automatically. A young man had to follow a strictly defined path. At around 7 years of age, I, like other boys, was sent to the home of a lord or relative where formal upbringing began. From that moment, I became a page. My training included elements of service and imitation. I ensured order, observed the knights, was present at rituals, and learned discipline and respect. My duties as a page included participating in ceremonies, caring for the clothing and weapons of elders, and running errands. My life was under constant supervision. A page had to memorize the manners, speech, and behavior of knights to subsequently conform to their image. By 15 or 16, a page became a squire. Now my functions approached combat duties. I accompanied the knight on travels and at assemblies, looked after his armor, led his horse, and participated in training. I was allowed to attend tournaments and hunts, and was entrusted with the care of equipment. In battles, the squire took a place in the battle formation, most often next to his master. I did not have the right to act on my own initiative, but I could find myself in a combat situation where the knight's survival depended on my actions. Some chronicles mention instances where squires entered combat if circumstances compelled them to take responsibility. A squire learned not only weapon handling, but also tactics, camp routine, and duties in peacetime. I observed courts, ceremonies, and negotiations, which gave me an understanding of the broader meaning of knightly service, as this was a trainee in the final stage of preparation for recognition. My knighting ceremony took place after I had reached maturity and earned trust. The ceremony completed a path that began in childhood. It took place in a solemn setting and confirmed that I was deemed worthy of the estate. The ceremony began with a ritual washing, a sign of purification before entering a new status. Then I spent the night in prayer, most often in the castle chapel, next to the weapons that would symbolize my future service. In the morning, I stood before my lord and knelt on one knee. I was presented with a sword and spurs, symbols of my new position. Then the Lord delivered a light blow to my shoulder with a sword, confirming my rank. This gesture held deep meaning. From that moment I gained the right to serve, command, bear a coat of arms, and be recognized as a knight among my peers. A king, a prominent feudal lord, or a recognized knight could perform the ceremony if they possessed sufficient authority. Next I uttered an oath, brief but meaningful. In it I pledged loyalty, to protect the weak, and to live honorably. Witnesses were present, and everything that transpired held public validity. After this I rose, and from that day on I could participate in military assemblies, manage land, and enter into vassal relationships. The knighting ceremony concluded the process of upbringing, service, and recognition, cementing my position as a warrior, vassal, and representative of the chivalric order. Although knighthood long remained a hereditary estate based on birth and upbringing in different historical periods, those who were not of noble birth could also be elevated to it. The basis for knighting became merits demonstrated in battle or loyalty to a lord or king. Such exceptions were particularly common from the late 12th century throughout the 13th century, when the social structure became more fluid. In the first half of the Middle Ages, knighting without noble lineage remained extremely rare. However, during the Crusades, more instances arose where commanders elevated warriors to knighthood who had distinguished themselves in battle or in the defense of holy sites. Chronicles mention warriors of humble origin who received the sword for their courage during sieges of fortresses or in battles with infidels. These were isolated but significant cases where action trumped lineage. In 13th century France and England, military service became increasingly professionalized. Some knights were not hereditary vassals, but veterans who had seen combat as part of royal armies. Such individuals, especially during periods of protracted conflict, could receive the title for loyal service. Kings and dukes used knighting as a means of securing loyalty. One notable example is Bertrand du Guesclin, the son of a minor Breton nobleman, who was knighted for his bravery in battles and subsequently became commander-in-chief of the French army. In some cases, townspeople and merchants who achieved influence and wealth could be knighted, especially if they financed military campaigns or performed administrative functions. In 14th century England, this became part of the practice, particularly in towns where self-governing structures developed. Such individuals were presented with a sword and shield. They participated in ceremonies and had the right to bear a coat of arms, but remained outside the noble system of inheritance. From the late 14th century, against the backdrop of strengthening centralized armies, mercenaries also began to lay claim to knightly status. They fought as part of regular troops, served under the banners of kings and dukes, received wages, and carried out orders. Some commanders, especially captains of large detachments, were elevated to knighthood as recognition of their experience and merits. This happened particularly often during periods of protracted wars, when the need for professionals outweighed the requirements of birth. The most famous example of a commoner receiving knightly status dates to the mid-15th century. Jacques de Lalaing, the son of a ducal court official, was not of noble birth, but thanks to outstanding bravery and participation in tournaments, he was knighted at the Burgundian court. Jacques' knighting underscored the growing role of personal merits and deeds in late medieval society. Although these cases remained exceptions, they demonstrate the gradual broadening of concepts associated with chivalry. The title retained its symbolic value, but its attainment was increasingly linked to personal qualities, military successes, and loyalty, rather than exclusively to lineage. After describing my journey of becoming a knight, it is necessary to consider the place of women within this structure. She did not participate in battles, but her position exerted an enormous influence on land relations, courtly culture, and social connections. Women played an important role in the environment in which chivalry developed. Her status was determined by birth, marriage, and family lineage. In feudal Europe, a woman could become an heiress if there were no direct male descendants in the family. In such cases, lands, titles, and the right to govern passed to her. This was particularly common in France and England. A feudal lord's widow retained the fief until remarriage, or until the property was transferred to an heir. She made decisions, conducted correspondence, and, if necessary, organized the defense of her holdings. One of the most famous examples was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her lands stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees. Before her marriage to Louis VI, she independently governed Aquitaine, and after their divorce, she married Henry Plantagenet and became Queen of England. Eleanor participated in affairs of the crown, accompanied her husband on diplomatic journeys, conducted correspondence, and retained influence even after being imprisoned by her husband's order for supporting her son's rebellion. Through marriage, women became a connecting link between families and strengthened feudal alliances. Their marriages were part of political calculations. Along with the woman, lands, legal rights, and symbolic legitimacy were transferred. Often it was marriage to an heiress that made me, the knight, the full owner of land. Marriage agreements had the force of law, and the distribution of power in the region depended on their terms. In courtly culture, I, the knight, often participated in tournaments in the name of a lady. Before entering the arena, I would declare her name and receive a token from her. This was usually a ribbon, a glove, or a belt, and I would dedicate any potential victory to her. But these actions were not an expression of romantic attachment. They affirmed my participation in the court's cultural system and cemented my status as a person recognized in the eyes of the nobility. A courtly lady acted as a patroness. She came from a noble family, had connections at court, and could publicly express approval. Such a woman had the ability to bestow awards, intercede for me at court, validate my reputation, and even indirectly influence decisions. Some ladies became patronesses to several knights at once. Their names are found in chronicles, songs, and correspondence. My conduct in the presence of a lady adhered to courtly norms, and any deviation was perceived as a breach of social order. In some cases, relationships extended beyond established boundaries. One such case is recorded in Burgundy in the late 14th century. Marguerite de Lair, wife of Jean de Chalon, had a relationship with the knight Pierre de Langelin, who was at her court and participated in ceremonies as her representative. When these relations became known to the Duke, the knight was arrested. The story became public and was recorded in chronicles as an example of an unacceptable blurring of personal affection and courtly duties. Outside the courtly circle, the position of women was different. Women not belonging to the nobility had no right to patronage, ritual service, or protection from the court. Their safety depended on the lord who controlled the land and on communal norms which were rarely consistently upheld. Documents from the 10th and 11th centuries preserve mentions of sexual violence for which knights were not punished. Force and power absolved them of responsibility. The Church tried to restrict such behavior through sermons, vows, and threats of excommunication, but these measures were merely symbolic. The contrast between idealized service to a lady and the reality on the ground was part of the feudal order. In Christian culture, the image of women was associated with the Virgin Mary. Her name was included in prayers, and her image was often placed on coats of arms, as she was considered the knight's patroness. The connection between religious purity and service to a lady was emphasized in texts and rituals, especially during the era of the Crusades. Although chivalry developed as an estate linked to male service and the right to bear arms, some women in the Middle Ages directly participated in military structures, land defense, and the performance of functions traditionally attributed to knights. Two such figures are Joan of Arc and Petronilla de Queen. Both women operated within a system where they formally could not claim the title of knight, but were perceived by contemporaries as its full-fledged bearers. Joan of Arc was born in the village of Domremy in the late 14th century. Her family belonged to the prosperous peasantry. From an early age, she claimed to hear the voices of saints guiding her toward a special mission: to help Charles Valois, the heir to the French throne, expel the English and restore justice. At about 16 years of age, she arrived in Vaucouleurs and appealed to the local garrison, requesting to be sent to the court. In the spring of 1429, Joan appeared before Charles VII, underwent theological scrutiny, and received permission to accompany the army. Soon she arrived at besieged Orléans and took a key role in the military campaign. Her appearance changed the atmosphere in the army and strengthened the soldiers' confidence. The victory at Orléans became a turning point. A few months later, Charles was solemnly crowned in Reims, and Joan accompanied him on campaigns, participated in war councils, and maintained a reputation as someone whose actions were determined not by personal interest but by perseverance and faith. She lived separately, wore armor, prayed daily, maintained order in the camp, and allowed no transgressions. Her image is that of a figure with inner discipline and a sense of destiny. Even those who were skeptical of her origins recognized the power of her influence. In 1431, she was captured while defending Compiègne. The Burgundians handed her over to the English, and a trial began. The formal charges were heresy and cross-dressing. Joan was tried in Rouen, and interrogations lasted for over 2 months. Ultimately, she was sentenced to execution by burning. It was carried out in the market square, and she was burned at the stake at the age of 19. 25 years later, her trial was annulled, and in the 20th century she was canonized. Her figure entered memory as an embodiment of resilience, devotion, and the highest form of service. Petronilla de Queen lived a century and a half before Joan, in the mid-13th century in the Languedoc region. She came from a minor noble family that owned a fortified fief. During an armed conflict between neighboring lordships, she found herself at the center of a siege. In the Chronicles of Saint Hilaire Monastery, there is a mention of how she organized the defense, took responsibility for the garrison, oversaw the deployment of supplies, and conducted negotiations. One of the charters drawn up after the lifting of the siege is preserved in the episcopal archives, and it bears her signature under the terms of the agreement. After the conflict ended, Petronilla continued to manage the fief. She participated in resolving land disputes, ratified marriage contracts, and managed family affairs without formal male intervention. Her contemporaries described her as a woman acting with firmness and calculation. The lack of knighting did not prevent her from performing the same functions: defending, governing, and maintaining order. Now let us delve into the equipment of me, the knight. When I went into battle, I always carried a sword, spear, and shield. Depending on the situation, I might carry a war hammer, axe, or mace. All equipment was chosen with the upcoming task in mind, and each item was significant, being part of preparation, status, and a guarantor of survival. The sword was considered the heart of my knightly armament. Its length was about 90 centimeters. It was a straight blade with a sharp point and a double edge, and the hilt ended with a guard that protected the hand, and a massive pommel that balanced the blade. With the sword I would hack, thrust, and parry blows. A good blade was forged from tempered steel, and often adorned with inscriptions, coats of arms, or a master's mark. The shield served not only as protection but also as a mark of distinction. In early centuries it was tear-shaped. Such a shape allowed it to protect not only the chest but also the thigh, covering the rider from shoulder to knee. When moving in the saddle, the lower part of the shield rested comfortably on the thigh, while the upper part covered the torso. Over time, the shape of shields changed. Rectangular or triangular shields appeared, becoming lighter and more convenient for infantry. The material was wood, glued in layers, and covered with leather and metal reinforcements. On the outer side, the coat of arms, family colors, or the Lord's emblem were applied. The shield allowed me to recognize an ally in battle, hold formation, and indicate affiliation. In urban garrisons and during sieges, a pavise was also used. This was a tall shield, capable of covering a person from head to toe. It was set vertically into the ground and served as cover for archers and crossbowmen. The pavise was heavy, more often used by infantry, and was not part of my everyday armament. However, its appearance in the 14th century signaled how diverse defensive measures had become. The spear played a crucial role in my cavalry charge, and its length could reach 3 meters. I would grip the shaft under my arm, brace a temporary loop against my armor, and aim the tip at the target. Upon impact, the force of the blow was amplified by the horse's speed. Such a blow would break the spear, pierce the shield, and dismount the opponent. In tournaments, the tips were blunted and the shafts reinforced to avoid killing the opponent. But even then, injuries were a common outcome. In close combat, I used war hammers, maces, and axes. The war hammer was especially effective against plate armor. Its spike could penetrate joints, while its massive head crushed armor. Maces delivered powerful blows to the body, shattering defenses. From the 11th century, two-handed swords appeared on the battlefield. Their length reached 120 centimeters, and their weight was about 2.5 kilograms. Such a sword had to be held with both hands, making the use of a standard shield impossible. Moreover, swinging it while in full armor was difficult, therefore I rarely used such blades. In foot combat, defending fortifications, in duels, or when facing spearmen, a two-handed sword was useful for breaking shields and spear shafts, as well as in combat against infantry. But in mass battles, it was less versatile than a regular sword. The cost of armament was high. In the 13th century, a set of sword, spear, shield, and auxiliary weapons could cost as much as the annual income from a small village. Young nobles often received weapons as gifts from a lord, king, or military order. But also as a reward, winners of tournaments and campaigns could receive a sword with personal symbolism, which strengthened their position within the knightly community. Body protection was also an extremely important part of my equipment. It determined how I would move, fight, and survive in battle. The first armors consisted of chainmail, a metal fabric woven from thousands of iron rings. Such armor covered the chest, shoulders, arms, and thighs, and a hood of the same construction was worn on the head. Chainmail absorbed cutting blows and distributed force across its surface, but offered little protection against heavy blunt weapons. Beneath it, I wore a soft underarmor garment, a thick quilted tunic called a gambeson. It cushioned blows and protected the skin from metal friction. The weight of chainmail reached up to 15 kilograms, and its use required stamina and habituation. Over time, protection became more complex. On my hands, I wore chainmail gloves, and on my legs, thigh guards, greaves, and polans, knee cops, while attaching metal plates over the chainmail. By the 14th century, full plate armor already appeared. It covered the entire body and consisted of steel elements fitted to the wearer's figure. Each element was connected by hinges and straps. The weight of plate armor reached up to 25 kilograms, but thanks to its even distribution it could be worn for hours. The manufacture of such equipment required the labor of a skilled master, time, and significant expense. It cost as much as it took to maintain a small armed detachment for the duration of a campaign. Helmets evolved particularly quickly. From simple iron skullcaps, they progressed to enclosed helmets with movable visors. A ventilation system, inner padding, and neck plates were developed. Special helmets with thickened protection and limited visibility were used in tournaments, but in battle I preferred simpler ones, with an open face or narrow slits. A coat of arms, feathers, or an animal image was often attached to the helmet as a distinguishing symbol or mark of affiliation. But heavy armor also had its serious drawbacks. Donning such armor independently was virtually impossible. Parts were fastened with straps, tied, buckled, and connected in a strict sequence. For this, I needed the help of a squire or servant who knew the exact order of assembly and fitting. If I was unhorsed, I found myself in a vulnerable position. It was incredibly difficult to rise from the ground in heavy armor, especially if the battle continued around me. The enemy would try to finish off the fallen with a blow to the visor, the neck, or the side between the plates. Sometimes a squire or comrade would help me, but more often the outcome was decided within seconds. This is why protection of the head, neck, and lower torso was considered critically important. Furthermore, it was impossible to move quickly across rough terrain in armor, and addressing basic needs became a problem. For long campaigns and sieges, lighter armors existed. However, in battle, where every blow could be the last, I remained in armor until the end, and biological inconveniences had to be endured. Many warriors restricted food and water intake before battle to avoid problems while armored. There are known cases where, during prolonged battles, knights relieved themselves directly in their armor. This was perceived as an inevitability, not a disgrace. Alongside armor, the warhorse played an equally important role. It was not only a means of transport but also a weapon, an extension of myself. The best steeds were called destriers. These were powerful, tall animals bred specifically for war. They underwent special training and were unafraid of shouts, spears, noise, and blood. A destrier was very expensive. In the 13th century, the price of a warhorse was comparable to, and could even exceed, that of a full set of armor. Steeds were also protected with equipment. Iron or chainmail barding was placed on their necks, and thick fabric or metal plates on their bodies. Some steeds wore helmets and had special bridles with emblems and decorations. The loss of a horse in battle was considered a heavy blow, for beyond its cost for me, the knight, it was part of my rank, a source of pride, heritage, and trust. In chronicles, the names of famous warhorses are preserved, just like those of their riders. Within the knightly sphere, an unwritten code of combat existed, based on the idea of mutual recognition and honor. It was not enshrined in written laws but regulated behavior on the battlefield, and determined who was worthy of mercy, ransom, or respect. These rules did not preclude brutality, but imposed certain limitations on combat, especially concerning other knights. On the battlefield, we knights behaved not as anonymous soldiers, but as representatives of a specific social order. Among us, unwritten rules operated based on mutual recognition. A knight with a coat of arms and noble lineage was considered a worthy opponent. He was not needlessly finished off, especially if he clearly expressed a wish to surrender. If a knight fell from his horse, lost his weapon, or was wounded, he could declare his surrender. To do so, it was enough to state his name, lineage, or at least clearly declare his submission. In such cases, the enemy would cease the attack. Surrender was possible even mid-battle, for we warriors knew that captives were ransomed. For a noble captive, family or suzerain would pay in gold, property, or concessions in negotiations. The ransom amount depended on the captive's social standing. For an earl or baron, the sums were enormous, while for a common knight, they were moderate. Capture was not considered a disgrace, but rather a part of military practice. Moreover, the capture of a noble enemy was a prestigious achievement. Some knights specifically tried to capture rather than kill, especially if they recognized their opponent as someone of renown. There were even verbal agreements defining who had the right to a captive. If a captive was surrounded by several horsemen simultaneously, disputes were resolved by the first touch of a weapon or verbal claim. After surrender, the captive was handed over to guards. He was provided with food, allowed to rest, and sometimes permitted to wear part of his armor. Important captives were allowed to write. They could send a message via a messenger, requesting ransom. The most noble prisoners were kept in castles or commanders' tents. Sometimes they were released under oath to return if the ransom was not delivered on time. However, not all enemies were considered worthy by us knights. Infantrymen were usually not spared. They were considered militarily inferior and a threat in cases of mass resistance. If a foot soldier surrendered, he was more often finished off, as no one would pay ransom for him. Exceptions were extremely rare, occurring only if the infantryman happened to be related to a noble family or displayed extraordinary bravery. Battles rarely unfolded as organized duels. The core of combat consisted of blows within dense formations. Horsemen charged, armed with lances, striking from the saddle and crashing into one another. The battle lasted several hours, and chaos emerged after the first onslaught. I didn't always know who stood before me, friend or foe. Distinction was made by the coat of arms on a shield or surcoat, but sometimes one's own could strike one's own. Squires tried to stay close by to help one rise, replace weapons, or relay orders. Psychologically, I, a knight, was prepared for combat. From childhood, I was taught restraint, self-control, humility before God, and loyalty to my lord. But even an experienced warrior felt fear. Some warriors entered a frenzy, others became withdrawn. There were those who fled the battlefield, and those who perished without retreating a single step. The concept of heroism was defined by actions, not words. True valor was considered saving one's lord, carrying a banner out of encirclement, covering a retreat, or holding a narrow pass. These instances were recorded in chronicles. There are accounts of a knight fending off multiple enemies or continuing to fight while wounded. Such stories spread, adding weight to the family and increasing the standing of the lineage. Death on the battlefield was perceived as a worthy outcome. I, a knight, died in full armor alongside my comrades beneath the banners. My body was buried with my weapon, sometimes alongside my slain horse. If the body could not be recovered, my name was entered into the lists of the fallen and commemorated in churches. These norms remained in effect until the end of the 15th century. Thereafter, mass armies, crossbows, cannons, and mercenaries transformed the nature of warfare, but in the classical era of knighthood, honor on the battlefield mattered, and it was defined not by victory, but by how I conducted myself in the face of death. Military conflicts during the age of chivalry erupted not only within Europe, but also far beyond its borders. One of the most significant arenas where we knights distinguished ourselves were the so-called Crusades or wars, in which military service was combined with a religious mission. These campaigns formed a special chapter in the history of knighthood, where my participation in combat was perceived as an act of spiritual valor. The Crusades became an important part of our knightly culture. They combined religious duty, the pursuit of glory, and the opportunity to acquire land. For many of us, participation in such an expedition meant recognition, service to the church, and a path to advancement. In the feudal world where military service defined our status, the expedition to the east was perceived as the highest form of service. By the mid-11th century, Muslim armies had captured Jerusalem and began threatening Christian pilgrims. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos appealed to Western powers for aid. The response was Pope Urban II's call at the Council of Clermont in 1095. He appealed to the knights of all Europe, urging them to liberate the Holy Land and protect Christians from oppression. The call elicited an immense response. Participation in the expedition was seen as a way to atone for sins. A papal bull guaranteed absolution. If a person fell in battle, it changed the attitude towards war. Combat ceased to be merely a vassal's duty. It became a matter of faith. Thousands of knights from France, the German lands, Italy, and England set off for the east. For us, this was a chance to prove ourselves, gain wealth, and acquire lands within the former Byzantine territories, regions referred to as the Holy Land in Western sources. Some left their homeland with a retinue of squires, servants, and vassals. The campaigns lasted for years, requiring constant supplies and participation in sieges. The battles for Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli tested our courage and military prowess. Participation in a crusade elevated my status as a knight. My name was mentioned in chronicles, and my descendants prided themselves on their connection to the church's cause. In many cases, the expedition became an occasion for formal knighting. If a warrior distinguished himself in battle, receiving gratitude from commanders and priests, he could be elevated to the knightly order right in the camp. This gave the knighting ceremony special significance. It was performed by bishops, barons, and sometimes even the king himself. Such a knight was perceived as a defender of the faith, and his status was recognized by all. Some knights participated in the Crusades from childhood. Sons of noble families accompanied their fathers and learned to fight in foreign lands. This was part of their upbringing. For successful participation, a young man received a sword, shield, and a right to wear spurs. His name was inscribed into the circle of knights who had passed through blood and prayer. The Crusades were also perceived as a spiritual path. The imagery of pilgrimage, holy war, and fighting for the faith became part of our culture. Expeditions to the east were illuminated by sermons, songs, and legends. Every knight who served in the Holy Land was perceived as a witness to a special era. My shield could bear a cross, my sword the imprint of an oath, and my name the memory of a holy duty. However, these campaigns were also accompanied by cruelty. Breaches of discipline, looting, disputes among commanders, massacres, and conflicts with Byzantium and Muslims left dark marks. The capture of Constantinople in 1204 was particularly tragic when Western knights plundered the Christian city. This event undermined trust between East and West, and demonstrated how far the aims of the Crusades could diverge from their original intent. Nevertheless, participation in the Crusades became an important stage in the history of knighthood. These wars contributed to the formation of a distinct military culture, in which religion, glory, and duty united in a singular service. In the next chapter, we will explore how these very ideas formed the basis for the emergence of knightly orders, fighting brotherhoods united not only by the sword, but also by an oath of faith. Military orders became one of the most striking and enduring manifestations of knightly culture. They arose as a response to the demands of the time, the need to protect pilgrims, guard holy sites, and hold conquered lands. Unlike ordinary knights, whose service depended on personal fealty, vassalage, and familial ties, members of the orders adhered to strict rules and collective discipline. Their ideology combined monastic rigor with constant military readiness. The most renowned of these orders was the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Templars. It was founded in Jerusalem at the beginning of the 12th century, around 1109, by a group of French knights led by Hugues de Payens. The order's initial task was to guard roads and protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. With the permission of the King of Jerusalem, they were granted a residence next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which stood on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. Hence the name, the Templars. The order quickly gained recognition from the Church. In 1128, Pope Innocent II granted the Templars special privileges. They were subject only to the Holy See, had the right to build their own churches, and were exempt from taxes. This made them independent of local authorities and strengthened their discipline. The order's rule was written under the guidance of Bernard of Clairvaux, an influential abbot and theologian. It included requirements for humility, poverty, celibacy, and constant bearing of arms. Templars were not permitted to leave the order, wore white cloaks with a red cross, and obeyed their commanders just as monks obeyed their abbots. The order's combat effectiveness was high. The Templars participated in key battles in the east, at Ascalon, in the defense of Jerusalem, and at Hattin. Their units were disciplined, well-armed, and distinguished by their resilience. In battle, they fought at the center of formations or formed shock groups. Their military successes made the order respected and wealthy. Soon, the Templars acquired possessions in Europe, lands, castles, and commanderies. They began conducting financial operations, issuing loans, safeguarding pilgrims' funds, and even transferring money for kings. Another influential order was the Hospitallers, or the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Its history began slightly earlier, with the establishment of a hospice for pilgrims in Jerusalem in the mid-11th century. In 1113, the order was officially recognized by the Pope and transformed into a military organization. The Hospitallers wore black cloaks with a white cross and remained true to the ideals of charity and protection. Their duty remained the treatment of the wounded and care for the sick. But in conditions of constant warfare, they became a full-fledged military force. Their garrisons defended fortresses, guarded caravans, and participated in sieges. Both orders built a network of fortresses in the eastern Mediterranean, from the Syrian coast to the mountainous Galilee. Among them were Montfort, Crac des Chevaliers, and Safed. These outposts became symbols of the West's enduring presence in the East. The knight warriors of the order obeyed the Grand Master and lived by a rule where personal initiative yielded to collective discipline. Their vows were for life, and leaving the order was considered treason. The Teutonic Order, the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, also played a special role in the history of the Middle Ages. It was founded around 1190 during the Siege of Acre, when German knights organized a hospital fraternity to aid the wounded. Within a few years, the order adopted the rules of the Templars and Hospitallers, becoming an independent military force. Its members wore white cloaks with a black cross and spoke German, which made the order particularly appealing to knights from the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike orders operating primarily in the Holy Land, the Teutons shifted their activities to Eastern Europe. From the early 13th century, they began a struggle against the Baltic tribes, as well as the Prussians and Lithuanians, establishing their own monastic state in the lands of southern Baltics. There they built castles, established German law, created a feudal administration, and waged prolonged military campaigns. Throughout the 13th-15th centuries, the order became an independent political force, entering into alliances, concluding peace treaties, and opposing Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Teutonic Order maintained the discipline, vows, and ideology inherited from its predecessors, yet created a stable state structure that lasted for over 2 centuries. It became the embodiment of a transition from pilgrim service to territorial knightly rule. Military orders, which emerged during the Crusades, combined service to faith with the discipline of the sword. But orders also existed within Europe itself. They sought to preserve knightly ideals in changing conditions. As the feudal structure lost its strength and noble honor demanded new forms, new brotherhoods began to appear at monarchical courts. Not military ones, but symbolic. In the second half of the 14th century, the knightly ideal ceased to be the foundation of the military system, but retained its value as a symbol of loyalty, ethics, and noble rank. Monarchies sought to preserve the spirit of knighthood by giving it a new form as a regulated privilege and honorary brotherhood at the royal court. Thus emerged courtly orders, which formalized knightly values within the royal hierarchy, giving them a new ritualized form. In England, such a symbol became the Order of the Garter, instituted in 1348 by King Edward III. It comprised 26 knights, personally chosen by the king, and was considered the highest award for military merit and personal loyalty to the monarch. Windsor Castle became the order's residence, where solemn ceremonies were held and the insignia were kept. The knight's garter was dark blue with golden letters of the motto, which read, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. It was worn on the thigh and symbolized belonging to the highest circle of knightly honor. Its rituals retained elements of medieval solemnity, investitures, feasts, and participation in processions, but their significance was now more courtly than martial. The order transformed into a tool for political recognition and strengthening loyalty, rather than a military brotherhood. In France, the equivalent was the Order of the Star, founded in 1351 by King John II. Known as the Good, its creation was preceded by a desire to revive the moral foundation of knighthood, to make the nobility an example for their subjects. The order's symbol was the Star of Bethlehem, and members were exclusively nobles who had proven their loyalty in service to the king. Unlike the English model, the French order had a distinctly religious character, emphasizing submission to spiritual authority and adherence to dogma. However, the order's statutes included rules prohibiting retreat from the battlefield, which became its tragic element. During the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, many members of the order perished, unwilling to break their given vow. King John himself was captured, and the order's reputation was undermined. Despite their formal differences, both orders reflected an attempt to adapt knightly ideology to changing conditions. Former norms, based on personal oaths, were now codified in statutes approved by royal will. Membership in an order signified not only recognition of merit but also inclusion in a new circle of power, where symbols of knighthood served as an expression of state and dynastic stability. Members of the orders participated in negotiations, ceremonies, diplomatic missions, and their conduct became a model for the court aristocracy. Knightly orders solidified the discipline, structure, and symbolism of the estate. But the inner essence of knighthood rested not solely on statutes. Behind the coats of arms, mottos, and rituals lay an ideal of conduct that was not always written down, but was transmitted through upbringing, ritual, and custom. This unwritten code dictated what I, a man bearing a sword and shield, ought to be. It formed the moral axis of our social order. The code of honor ascribed to a knight combined personal valor, loyalty, and obedience. I, a knight, was expected to be loyal to my liege, not to retreat in battle, to keep my word, and to maintain order in relations with subordinates. The oath played a special role. Its violation was considered not merely an error but a moral fall, threatening expulsion from the circle of equals. Duty to one's lord, society, and God was linked to the concept of righteous service, where outward valor corresponded to inner order. In the second half of the 12th century, under the Church's influence, the perception of me, a knight, as a protector not only of my own castle but also of all the weak, intensified. It was expected that I would stand by widows, orphans, and all the dispossessed. These demands were partly symbolic but carried significant weight. I was attributed the duty of being a fair judge, a restrained victor, and a generous patron. The very image of a horseman standing between evil and the defenseless became part of the general conception of ideal order. A special place in this code was occupied by the theme of service. I, a knight, served those I considered above myself, God, my suzerain, and my chosen lady. This emphasized my discipline and subordination to hierarchy. The ideal was one who could master himself, control his passions, and act out of duty. Against the backdrop of feudal cruelty, it was precisely inner self-restraint that became the distinguishing feature of a noble warrior. Service to a lady held its place in this system. It was not personal in nature, but a form of courtly ritual. I, a knight, acting on behalf of a noblewoman, demonstrated my belonging to high society, my discipline, and my recognition of authorities. This ceremony took place within the framework of tournaments, duels, and poetic contests. A varied offering from a high-born lady did not signify an intimate relationship, but was an act of symbolic submission. Courtly love became an expression of courtly ideology. Its rituals, described in poetry and ballads, demanded moderation, constancy, and humility from the knight. In the songs of troubadours, the lady became an unattainable ideal. And I, a knight, was her servant, ready to suffer, obey, and remain silent. This created an atmosphere in which social tension between the estates was eased through noble forms of interaction. One of the most famous examples is the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, in which love for a lady connected to the king places the knight in an internal conflict between feeling and duty. Such narratives became the foundation of European chivalric literature. The knight's code concerned not only combat behavior, but also external appearance. From me, a knight, cleanliness of attire, neatness, noble speech, manners, the ability to conduct myself at court, engage in conversation, and uphold the honor of my lineage were expected. All this was considered no less important than the ability to fight. Thus the code became the basis of my cultural identity, uniting external ritual and inner discipline. In practice, however, my actions, the actions of knights, were often far from ideal. Behind words of honor and loyalty lay another image, crude, self-interested, and reliant on brute force and personal gain. Medieval society permitted many forms of violence, and I, a knight, in this society, possessed legitimate authority to use force. In conditions where laws were weak and justice often replaced by the sword, our knightly order exerted pressure on the surrounding world, not only in times of war, but also in daily life. We knights could declare blood feuds, initiate sieges, or lead a retinue to restore justice, by which was understood the seizure of territory or vengeance for an insult. Such conflicts were considered personal but often escalated into prolonged wars between families. Attacks on castles, burning of villages, and taking captives for ransom, all this was part of the political toolkit. Paradoxically, outward ceremony was still observed. An opponent would be challenged to battle, a messenger sent, and a symbolic gauntlet delivered. But the essence remained the same, a struggle for power, land, and influence. The plight of the common people was particularly severe. An armed knight, holding power over lands, dictated the fate of peasants as if they were his own property. Instances of rape, forced requisitions, and destruction of livelihoods for disobedience are recorded in many chronicles. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Church attempted to restrict such actions by introducing the Peace of God movement, or a prohibition on violence against the unarmed and clerics. But in reality, such norms were rarely adhered to. Peasant homes were burned, crops destroyed, and families were taken captive or subjected to cruel treatment. The chronicles of Geoffroy de Villehardouin and Guibert of Nogent cite instances where entire villages were destroyed for attempting to evade taxes or refusing supplies. During feudal wars, we knights could not merely burn settlements but also carry out punitive actions. One such case occurred in the region of Laon in the early 12th century, when, after the death of a knight, the peasants refused to hand over the killer. In retaliation, the entire village was surrounded and set ablaze, and those who tried to escape were slaughtered, with no one facing punishment. Cruelty was also evident in small matters. Complaints have survived of knights beating people in market squares for not stepping aside in time from the road. The Miracles of St. Foy describes an episode where one lord knocked out a baker's teeth because he did not bow low enough. Benedictine monks in the Chronicles of Cluny Abbey report that clerics were beaten for delaying the payment of tithes, and women for refusing food and lodging. Such acts of arbitrary power were part of life, where I, a knight being beyond control, acted according to my own will. Even during the Crusades, where we acted as warriors of faith, instances of looting, massacres, and reprisals were not uncommon. Upon the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, up to 70,000 people perished. The city was plundered, mosques destroyed, and Jewish quarters burned. The Crusaders justified their actions as righteous wrath. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the principal leaders, did not hinder the violence. He refused the royal title but concentrated power in the Holy Land in his own hands. Lands were distributed to his close associates, new taxes were imposed, and authority rested on force rather than on law. William Marshal, who lived in England in the 12th and early 13th centuries, is considered an exemplary knight. He served at the courts of 4 kings, participated in wars, court proceedings, and negotiations. But his career began with participation in tournaments where the sole aim was to acquire money. He also captured defeated opponents and demanded ransom. Through such methods he amassed his fortune. Only after becoming an Earl and Regent of England did he begin to pursue the very policy of honor that his biographers glorified. Thus the knightly code did not exclude violence. It merely attempted to give it a form. Violation of an oath did not always lead to condemnation, but it was almost always justified by a higher purpose. Beyond military activities, leisure occupied a significant portion of my life, the life of a knight. In periods between campaigns, sieges, and conflicts, I remained a part of courtly culture, participating in ceremonies, socializing with lords, and enhancing my reputation through involvement in rituals. The most prominent form of such leisure became knightly tournaments, a place where combat skills were honed, virtues displayed, and matters of honor and status resolved. A tournament was not merely a spectacle, but an integral part of my knightly life. It combined military training, public recognition, and political calculation. In feudal Europe, where wars were not waged continuously, a tournament became a place where I could prove my strength, gain renown, and expand my network of connections. Participation in tournaments was almost obligatory for those who sought fame and service. The first records of such contests date back to the 11th century. In the early stages, tournaments were mass engagements of detachments, often in fields between castles. These were dangerous events, for we knights fought with full force. Weapons were real, and injuries were common. By the 12th century, the tournament acquired a more formalized character. A division into disciplines emerged, among which the joust, where 2 horsemen collided with lances in a confined space, took center stage. The rules of jousting involved a mounted combat with a long lance, blunted at the tip but with a solid point. The goal was either to unseat the opponent or to break the lance, his shield, or his armor. The exact number of broken lances could determine the victor. Sometimes the fight continued with foot weapons if both participants remained mounted after 3 blows. Victory brought glory, and in certain cases, ransom for the defeated. Tournaments of this kind were especially valued at courts, where records of results were kept, and symbolic prizes awarded. There were also dueling contests, more often with swords or maces. These bouts took place in an enclosed area, a so-called lists, and were accompanied by strict limitations. Sometimes blunted weapons were used, but by no means always. Victory was awarded upon losing a helmet, falling to the ground, or by judge's decision depending on the conditions. Such duels allowed for the display of not only strength, but also technique, composure, and close-quarters weapon mastery. Tournaments were held on specially prepared grounds near cities or castles. Their setup required funds, so feudal lords or kings were responsible for their organization. Before the tournament, flags and coats of arms of the participants were displayed, and judges ensured adherence to rules. The tournament was accompanied by ceremonies, presentation of knights, bestowal of ribbons and gloves from ladies, solemn oaths, and sometimes prayers in a chapel. The presence of noble ladies and representatives of the high nobility made the tournament a place for prestigious socializing. Prizes could include the defeated opponent's weapon, ransom for the loser, gold coins, a horse, or luxury items. In some cases, the victor received patronage, a court position, or a marriage proposal. It was particularly valued to receive a token of attention from a noble lady, a ribbon, belt, or wreath, which became a symbol of triumph. The tournament was also used as a means of gaining political favor, for I, a knight who impressed a powerful lord, might receive an invitation to service or a grant of land. The tournaments themselves followed a clear ritual scheme. Drums announced the start. Participants emerged in full armor and lined up according to the colors of their coats of arms. Before the duel, I would state my name and lineage. Some addressed the lady on whose behalf they fought. Judges recorded the outcome and announced the victor. The defeated could be taken captive, for whom a ransom was then paid. These actions mimicked real wartime conditions but in a more controlled format. Beyond combat disciplines, we knights participated in archery contests, spear throwing, fencing, intellectual games, recitation of ballads, and composition of courtly poetry. Many tournaments were accompanied by feasts, dances, and theatrical performances. It was a time when we not only fought but also demonstrated knowledge of etiquette and manners. In knightly culture, there existed a special type of duel, distinct from tournaments and combat engagements. This was a formalized fight or duel, conducted by agreement between parties, often under the control of a lord or royal court. A duel could resolve disputes over honor, inheritance, accusations of crimes, or breaches of oath. Its conduct adhered to strict customs, and the victor was deemed righteous not only in the eyes of men, but also before God. The oldest form was the judicial ordeal by combat, prevalent in the 10th-12th centuries. If one knight accused another of a grave offense, such as treason, violence, or falsehood, they might not appeal to a court in the modern sense. Instead, a duel was appointed, considered an ordeal. It was believed that God would not permit a liar to win. The fight took place on a designated ground in the presence of judges, priests, witnesses, and the lord who sanctioned the decision. The vanquished was considered guilty and could be stripped of title, land, or executed on the spot. Such a duel was an act of justice where iron replaced the word of law. However, not all accused fought in person. In certain cases, I, a knight, could appoint a champion, especially if I was elderly, ill, or lacked the necessary strength. Such an opportunity was afforded by one's social standing and status. A champion would fight on behalf of the accused, for instance, a professional fighter, or a junior knight willing to take the risk. Victory or defeat still bore upon the honor of the accused. There were also instances when the accused attempted to avoid the duel by paying off the accuser or invoking the church's protection, but this was condemned as cowardice. A famous example is the duel between Jean de Courrouges and Jacques Legris, which took place in Paris in 1386. Courrouges accused Legris of assaulting his wife. The court could not reach a conclusion, and with the permission of King Charles VI, a trial by combat was ordered. The duel took place before hundreds of spectators, including the entire royal court. Courrouges won, and the loser was executed. This was the last officially sanctioned judicial duel in France. Beyond judicial duels, duels of honor also became widespread in the culture of mature chivalry. These were conducted between knights of equal status, usually without court intervention. The cause could be an insult, refusal of apology, public humiliation, interference in marital affairs, or patronage of a lady without her consent. The duel took place by agreement in the presence of witnesses and was accompanied by ceremonies such as the announcement of grievances, confirmation of lineage by oath on the sword, and combat with chosen weapons. Victory in such a duel restored honor, while defeat meant disgrace. If one of the participants refused, he could be declared a coward and lose his standing. Despite the strictness of the ritual, the outcome was often decided by brute force or luck. Some duels ended in severe injury, death, or the expulsion of the loser. Many 13th century chronicles mention such clashes between noble knights, especially in Italy, Spain, and southern France. With the development of state courts and the intervention of royal power, knightly duels began to be restricted. The Church condemned them as a manifestation of pride and vigilantism. In the 15th century, duels gradually shifted into the realm of aristocratic custom and ceased to be a part of the military class. However, in the knightly tradition, the duel forever remained a symbol of courage, determination, and the last resort for defending one's honor when all other words had been exhausted. As the knightly order was reinforced by rituals, tournaments, and statutes, events began to unfold on battlefields that irreversibly transformed Europe's military structure. The end of the 13th century became an era in which a new force emerged, organized infantry, armed with long-range weapons and supported by centralized states. All that for centuries had constituted my military and social advantage, the advantage of a knight, proved vulnerable to this new reality. A key turning point was the proliferation of the crossbow, a weapon capable of piercing armor even at a significant distance. The crossbow was simple to master. A few weeks of training were enough for a peasant to hit a target over 100 paces away. Against the backdrop of me, a knight, whose training took years, this became a factor in the collapse of class superiority. Crossbowmen were particularly widely used in Italian and Gascon armies. Their actions were effective both in the field and during sieges. Mercenary crossbowmen also emerged, organized into companies and operating independently of feudal ties. In parallel, the importance of infantry with long spears and pikes grew. In Switzerland and Scotland, peasants began forming units capable not only of repelling cavalry charges, but also of launching offensives. These phalanx-like formations had an advantage in density, stability, and maneuverability. Commoners, armed mostly minimally, could, with proper tactics, destroy a fully equipped knightly detachment. The Battle of Crusades in 1346 marked a turning point. The French army, composed mainly of nobility, was confident of its victory. However, the English, having established a position on high ground, deployed detachments of archers, firing from powerful wooden longbows. Drawn with a force of 150 pounds, arrows flew in volleys of 3 to 4 per minute, engulfing us knights before we could even approach. Attempts at advance were thwarted wave after wave. Many representatives of France's most noble families perished. After this incident, it became clear that the charge of knighthood could be halted technologically and tactically. Almost 70 years later, in 1415, a new tragedy for knighthood occurred on the fields of Agincourt. The French army, vastly outnumbering the English, held an advantage in cavalry and weaponry. However, rains made the ground boggy. French knights, forced to attack in mud and cramped conditions, could not deploy their full strength. The English unleashed a hail of arrows upon them. By the time the French reached the infantry, they were exhausted, their armor heavy with moisture, and many were unhorsed and finished off by foot soldiers. Only those who could be ransomed were taken captive. The very structure of armies also changed. Instead of the feudal principle where lords raised their vassals, kings began to form mercenary armies. Funding came from taxes and service was based on contracts. Mercenaries acted disciplined, received wages, and were not tied to the land. This rendered the knightly model obsolete. A person without a title but possessing a weapon became no less important than a hereditary warrior. Economics also played a decisive role. Equipping me, a knight, required significant resources: plate armor, a well-fed warhorse, personal weapons, a shield with a coat of arms, servants and squires. All this together cost as much as the income from a small estate. Few nobles could afford such a level of equipment without the support of a powerful lord or king. Moreover, my effectiveness as a knight on the battlefield decreased. I yielded to mobile pikemen, suffered from the concentrated fire of archers, and when unhorsed, lost my advantage completely. More and more often, I, a knight, was saved only by my ransom value. Meanwhile, in the cities, merchants and artisans grew wealthy. They formed their own detachments, guarded caravans, hired warriors, and even participated in battles as urban militias. Cities erected fortifications, maintained armories, and no longer needed the protection of feudal lords. This definitively undermined the monopoly of knighthood on military force. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the history of knighthood. I hope it was as interesting and informative for you as it is for me when I narrate it. If you enjoyed it, please support my narration, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Many more captivating topics lie ahead. See you under the arches of the next story.